Let's talk a little bit about the concept. I mean, because I think this needs to be solidified a little bit. But when we talk about something called British Muslim civil society, it's an extremely catchy, it's a very interesting, once again, I would say concept. And the report that was launched in Parliament a few weeks back makes really fascinating findings. I mean, obviously, this comes probably in parallel, I wouldn't say on the back of, but in parallel with the announcement of certain stats from the census of 2021. Which shows that the Muslim community in the UK now constitutes around 6.5%. And also speaks of the various facets of that particular community in terms of age, in terms of professional engagement, in terms of, various other aspects. But if I was to go back to that initial definition, a concept, do you really read into this, your research over many years, that it goes beyond the concept, that it is some element of reality in this?
So, I mean, in many respects, and it's wonderful to have Neil in the studio because Neil is one of the main commissioners for the Missing Muslims report. This is something which is spoken of throughout that report. That report's actually far more extensive than this one. And so, there is a tradition of reflecting about the situation of the Muslim community in this country. And I think we very deliberately used that catchy phrase, as you put it, the British Muslim Civil Society report, because we have an aspiration to make this an ongoing conversation. It's called the British Muslim Civil Society Report of 2023. Hopefully there will be further ones in the future, which allows for an ongoing conversation on issues that Muslims don't tend to think of their own communities in terms of civil society. That's a third sector specialist term almost that we use in thinking about policy, we use in thinking about public discourse and public debates and the charity sector more generally. And Muslims, I think, as a relatively young community in this country, still many of us, might have been born outside the country. I happen to have been born in this country. And in that sort of situation, we're not completely used to the vocabularies that might be used by the policy circles, by the government, by the third sector as a whole. And so this was a deliberate attempt to carve out a space for Muslims. And I think it does exist, to answer your question somewhat directly. There is a Muslim charity sector that's very vibrant that people have been talking about for years. One of the quotes I have from David Cameron in a Ramadan address from about a decade ago is saying that the Muslims are the most generous community in this country.
Yeah, I remember that. Yes, correct. Now, I mean, I totally get that. But if I was, and I'm of, if I may, Usaama, an older generation, I arrived in this country as a very, very young boy in the early 70s. And if I was to be asked up until recently about a British Muslim civil society, I would mention two sectors. I would mention the mosques and Islamic centers, and probably the charity sector. And the charity sector essentially for donating towards causes like Palestine or like Kashmir or like
international
Iraq
disasters
or the such. So in a way, also a charity sector that doesn't necessarily feed into the British Muslim society itself or community itself. But clearly from reading the executive summary of the report, this is a very, very simplified version of the reality.
Yeah, I was just going to congratulate you on the report because it follows on effectively from the Missing Muslims report that Citizens UK produced and started in 2015 and 2017, also focused on civil society. So I don't see it as a concept. I see it as a struggle. The most important sector of society is civil society. It's people. As a non-Muslim, I hope not to blunder on make mistakes, but the Ummah is significant. It's a sort of Muslim civil society, the concept of Ummah, isn't it? Because it excludes government. The point is, we tend to think that everything has to happen by government, and the papers do, and what's Rishi Sunak doing now, that sort of thing. Whereas I believe, and citizens believed, and Islam believes that it's the people, it's the organized people that matter. they are ignored, or we are just viewers of what's going on, because it's increasingly with celebrities and so on, we just watch people do things. Whereas we are citizens in reality, politically, we can make things happen if we organize well. And I think the report particularly is very good on statistics. As you say, the Muslim community is growing in muscle, it's youthful, and hopefully it will take a lead and not be subservient to government, not be subservient to the media. The media is very important, but it's not the main thing, which is why the statistics are good and encouraging. But also it is, as the other reports, I've got the MCB's report that came out in 2019 or 20, I think it was, which more or less, they all say the same thing. We're doing well, but there are hurdles that we have to cross. And these aren't, well, some of them are hurdles with civil society, where people are nervous, don't think they've got a role to play, don't vote, don't move out of their area effectively. So that's a big hurdle.
Is it, one of the questions that came to mind as soon as I actually heard of the release of the report in Parliament, I thought to myself, we're living in a secular society, and yet we're defining or identifying a faith group within this society, and calling it a civil society in itself. Is that not some sort of anomaly? Is that something that we're sort of clutching from thin air and in reality has very little
That's
roots?
a very deliberate choice that we made.
I thought that might be.
In writing about this. And one of the points that, if I am able to find the sort of relevant quote, this is on page 21 of the report. While it is understandable in the light of broader trends towards secularization that major institutions have increasingly tended to view religion as marginal, the unqualified adoption of such a perspective is liable to marginalize Britain's growing Muslim minority. We live in a sort of pluralistic society, and it's true that the dominant trends are secular. The census data indicates that actually the fastest growing sort of religious trend is irreligion, or a lack of belief in God. There's been a precipitate drop within Christianity in this country, so it's now a minority religion in the UK, despite are technically having a head of state who is also the head of the church. But what's climbed the most dramatically is non-religion. Yet Muslims are steadily growing, and they're a very sizable minority. They're very active and vibrant in their charitable activities in the third sector. And so we need to recognize, actually, we should be inclusive to all of these different diverse sort of constituencies in our communities. We should build bridges, work with people of all faiths and none, to be able to realize a more harmonious civil society, more cohesive civil society, and a better Britain for the future.
When we talk about a civil society in general terms, it's one of the things that I used to teach when back in in the day when I was teaching. There are several facets of civil society, including trade unions. Does that apply here?
When I speak of civil society in this particular report, Muslims, I'm looking at where Muslims are quite active. So you mentioned earlier the mosque as a major center, and mosques as institutions are perhaps our largest sort of group of charities in this country. There are more than 2,000 mosques in this country. But civil trade unions or other sorts of organizations, particularly within the labor force, I think Muslims are still not very present in those contexts, and I think there is a lot of space for growth.
Give me an example of a section of society where they're lacking still.
Where they're lacking,
yeah,
right. I would say that one of the areas that I highlight is within the sort of grassroots media infrastructure. So this is an instance where Hiwar, as a channel that actually originally started as an Arabic channel, is branching out into an English sort of audience, partly because there's actually a lack. We all feel it. But I think, and this might not be pleasing to a lot of, our existing media institutions, because they're quite at an early stage of their development. But I am somewhat critical about the lack of infrastructure in those arenas. In other areas, in international development, we're world leaders. We set up organizations like Islamic Relief, because of that sort of charitable ethos and the recognition that we're living in a global village and in the advanced world, we have the opportunity to serve. But now there's been a shift where increasingly sort of Muslim civil society organizations are recognizing actually, and I think actually the Missing Muslims report has contributed to that sort of a shift in the conversation. There are sufficient problems here for us to direct our sort of charitable energies, our civil society activism.
Neil, the Missing Muslims report is quite a fascinating, again, we're talking about the title here. It's extremely fascinating. Tell us a little about it.
We came up with the title, that wasn't the original title, it was a Commission on Islam Participation in Public Life. It was partly driven by Dr. Barry, Dr. Muhammad Abdul Barry, because he was concerned, and he was very active in Citizens UK, concerned that up till 9/11, to an extent, the Muslim community was doing pretty well, was comfortable with itself and was participating and so on. But there was a conscious drop of participation, partly voting, taking on responsibilities that weren't particularly Muslim. That was what people did do. And it was as if the community had been shocked by, and of course the state was shocked by, terrorism, 9/11, 7/7. You could almost track it to those terrible events that took place that led to a reduction in participation by the Muslim community and a nervousness about participating. And I quite understand it. Clearly, if any other community was pilloried to the extent that the Muslim community was pilloried after the terrorist attacks and blamed and everything, it's a sort of natural thing to say, we've done everything, but basically nobody takes us seriously. We can't get jobs. There's massive evidence, the difficulty that anybody with an Arabic name has to get a job. And that increased substantially after the terrorist attacks. Sort of understandable, but basically we got to grow up. It wasn't the British Muslims who did that. It was one or two isolated individuals. It's always individuals that mess up, which is why the report was basically focusing on why are people not participating as they used to.
So Missing Muslims is not about Muslims being missing. It's about Muslims not taking up their rightful position in public life. That's essentially. Okay. I mean, it's quite fascinating. I have to say that in recent years, we've seen more and more research and studies go into the makeup, the role, the contribution, as well as obviously the challenges and hurdles and problems that arise from this. Once again, I'm going to use this term, the concept of the Muslim community. Obviously, there's a question of why is that? Why is that all of a sudden? Is it because they seem to be, from one sense to another, growing in terms of size and number? But is it also to do with their capacity and the influence?
I mean, I just wanted to sort of highlight that the Missing Muslims report, and Dr. Abdul Bari is one of the pioneers in the civil society space within this community, and one of my own mentors, and actually a mentor of a lot of people I know within the Muslim civil society space. I mean, he's one of the people who's actually thought about this in that sort of way, that when we think about this concept, we need to engage of civil society, of Muslim communal activism within Britain in a way that thinks about serving Britain's Muslims.
Which brings about another question regarding when you mentioned, the charity sector. I mean, how much of the millions and millions and millions being gathered every single year go to serve the Muslim community in Britain directly? I mean, that's another question, but I think it's interesting.
And I think the data is a bit difficult to find that. I mean, among the interviews I conducted was with the largest charity in the UK, Muslim charity in the UK, Islamic Relief. They gather funds from around the world. But it all comes through their UK office. And so I think that most recent income was something like 183 million. And when I asked them, how much do you have designated or dedicated to British sort of concerns? I think I don't have my notes in front of me, so please don't quote me on this necessarily, but I'm quoting myself on live television. It was 2 to 3 million. So it is a minuscule amount. Now, there are various reasons for this. One is that their raison d'etre was originally an international charitable institution that's working for relief efforts in other parts of the world. But the UK has seen sort of precipitate increases in sort of poverty, and the UN actually intervened a couple of years ago about our situation. Some commentators describe the UK as a poor country with some very rich people. And so in that sort of situation, I think this is naturally a concern for Muslims, even though Muslims are actually one of the census data points that was positive coming out of this year, the 2021 census, was that the levels of poverty have reduced somewhat in the UK. So in the Muslim community, in the 2010 census, it was 46% of Muslims lived in the 10% most deprived boroughs in the country. Now it's, according to MCB analysis, they kindly shared with me, it's 10% of, sorry, not 10%, it's 30%. So 46
right, okay.
down to 30%. Now that's still 3 times the average.
Of course.
Which is very problematic. We're 3 times more likely to be in the poorest.
It's an improvement, especially at times when the whole country is going through a cost of living crisis.
And so I think, those sorts of trends make it suddenly an opportunity for Muslims to look inward and say, look, one of the points I make is Muslims will say, look, I belong to Britain. This is my country. And to what extent am I responsible for the problems of this country, and not just thinking about, it's important for us to think about this travails of people suffering. We've witnessed Egypt and Turkey and Syria recently going through a horrendous earthquake, and they literally had another earthquake yesterday. And I think we should very actively be trying to support those sorts of institutions, or those sorts of crises. But one of the points that I make in the report is, if Muslims in the UK think strategically, they'll recognize if they develop the wherewithal to try and influence the policy decisions made by the government, they'll recognize that as much money as we're sending abroad, far more than that is being slashed from our international aid budgets by government policy. And it's worse than neutralizing the efforts that we're making. So I do think that we need to have this multi-pronged approach. And because we've reached a certain critical mass in terms of our population, because, as a result of efforts like Dr. Mohammed al-Bulbari, people like Neil, who have really spearheaded excellent initiatives through Citizens UK that have brought in the Muslim community to think strategically in these ways, we're starting to think, actually, let's not think in very simplistic terms of, okay, I've got some money in my pocket, I'm going to give it to charity, so it goes to Turkey. I'm also going to think about, okay, I've got some money in my pocket, let me fund this sort of policy research so that they publish something that will then have an impact on our FCO or whatever DCMS, so that those sorts of initiatives are supported by the strength of the government. We all pay our taxes.
It's quite interesting. Obviously, as a society, as a rich society, where we're going through a phase defined by a number of landmark events, including Brexit, for instance. Obviously, the political turmoil that we find ourselves in with everyone else, the cost of living crisis,
which has hit Britain far worse than many other places.
And obviously the ongoing wars in Ukraine, as well as Syria and various other countries of Arab and Muslim origin. The question is, how much of all of this actually impacts not only the performance, but the makeup of this civil society, as you call it? How much of it, for instance, we talked about which sectors are a little bit lacking and need, a more positive and driven contribution from the Muslim community. But I look across the board, and knowing Europe as well as I do, Britain does stand out in terms of, you find Muslims virtually everywhere, wherever you go. Whether you're looking at the media, at the arts, whether you're looking at drama, whether you're looking at sports, whether you're looking at politics, finance, Muslims are everywhere. But how much of this is sort of the trajectory is upward, and how much of it is incidental simply because of events, whether local or international?
I was just going to say, I've been reading the paper on the way here. It looks like Anas Sarwar could be the next leader of the Scottish National Party. He has a great Scottish accent. Anas Sarwar?
Hamza Yusuf.
Sorry, Hamza Yusuf, yes.
Anas Sarwar is
Anas Sarwar still is significant.
He's the head of the Labour, Scottish Labour.
Exactly, yes. So that's fantastic. And Scotland is leading the way, really, with that development.
Remarkable, actually.
I was just going to pick up what my friend was saying, really, about so to praise the Muslim community for pretty well anywhere you see homeless people being fed. It's a group of mostly Muslim women doing it around London here and doing it regularly in an organized way with hot soup and so on. But how many of them think about why are these people homeless? How many get involved in homeless action groups, not homeless action groups, housing action groups? Because there has to be a solution. I think it was Mahatma Gandhi who talked about a village where dead bodies kept coming down the stream, and the villagers pulled them out. Some weren't dead. They looked after them and put them in hospital and so on. And one day, the head of the village said, I'm going up the river to see why these people are coming back dead and bruised. And of course, that's the point. We have to do both things. And the Muslim community is very good at it, but nervous, I think. Nervous about standing up and saying, this is not right. This is not right according to teachings of Islam, but it's not right for social justice that people should not have a home. The tremendous work is done, of course, overseas. And I don't go that much, but I fall over Muslim aid organizations, and Islamic Relief is doing a great job in Turkey and Syria at the moment. What we don't see is Muslims saying, okay, we're going to help the refugees, not by feeding them, but by having them in our homes, by community sponsorship is an opportunity, particularly since most of the refugees that are coming here are Muslim, of course. And it's a little bee in my bonnet, or it's a big bee in my bonnet, that I've tried very hard to get Muslim groups to sponsor and welcome refugees. And they provide the money, they find the food, but actually going that extra step has proved difficult for all sorts of practical reasons. But I think the more the Muslim community can lead, because it's not, Britain is fine, but a lot of people are very lethargic and don't want to do anything and blame everyone else, and it's the Tories, it's the Labour and so on, which doesn't change anything if we just sit and chatter. It's much more, in fact, there's massive evidence that the people that change things are the people who get up and say this cannot happen. Throughout history, it's leadership that matters. And it's courage that matters. Aristotle said the most important value, I dispute that with your brother a bit, is that of courage in people. If you're not courageous, then you're not prepared to take anybody on. You can have wonderful ideas and be very generous and thoughtful and holy person, but courage says, here I stand, and I will go no further along this.
Neil, do you see this as slightly problematic when we're discussing British Muslim community or British Muslim civil society, in terms that we might be, I don't know, sort of pushing slightly inadvertently towards a little bit of isolationism, probably a little bit of exceptionalism. Is that at all, a possibility? Is that at all one of the questions that we might need to ask ourselves?
I mean, that's why the report was called "The Missing Muslims." It's not, but I'm not saying it's nothing to do with Islam. It's to do with racism, Islamophobia, and all that. And if I was a Muslim and I have to try 6 times harder than anyone else, particularly a Muslim woman, to get a job, I'd say, but there's nothing wrong with me. I've been to university, I've got a degree, but still I can't get the job. In fact, I can't even get shortlisted. There were some practical proposals in the Missing Muslims report, as there are in the other report, which was the business community had some responsibility in introducing a nameless application forms. Yeah. So you don't see the name of the person, you see their skills and what they've done before. Clifford Chance, I know, is one of the companies that does do that. It's limited because ultimately you've got to see the name of the person. I know you've got to meet with them, but they can't get a foot in the door. It says, "Oh, this is an Arabic name. Put it in the bin."
I think one journalist actually did sort of an experiment.
They've had a few
he
actually.
applied to the same companies using an absolute English name and then using a non-English Muslim name. And he got rejected on every single application because of the Muslim name.
Which is why, to your point, is well made. Is why I think the Muslim community is more nervous about standing up and shouting.
But at the same time, if I understood, another angle of what you're talking about is the fact that when we speak about British Muslim civil society as a separate entity, are we self-isolating? Is that a concern as well?
That probably, yes. Very.
Right,
I mean, the thing that I'm trying to understand here is, I mean, we for years, I know I have for years have been advocating for Muslims to integrate positively, to become part of society, to enter into all facets of life and the such. And I have to say, I've had my reservations concerning the sector of Muslim schools, for instance, because my concern was we don't want students to feel as though they are isolated or distant or exclusive from the rest of society. The question is this: I mean, does this sort of promote that?
I would hope it does quite the opposite, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, this is the ethos of reports like the Missing Muslims report that. And I follow in those footsteps, that we're trying to encourage Muslim communities to think of themselves as, direct and meaningful contributors to British society. So they are, a Muslim civil society, but they're a British Muslim civil society, and it's about contribution to society as a whole. And what's really sort of, in a sense, very heartwarming, going to all of these focus groups and speaking to a lot of young people as well, and seeing how much they internalize that sort of an ethos, that I'm really doing this because I think I have a duty to contribute to society. And it's not, they do recognize, look, as a Muslim, I do have a duty to try and help my immediate neighborhood where there will be lots of Muslims, but there's nothing exclusive about that. I'm not doing that because I think Muslims are really the only people that I'm interested in. No, actually, supporting everyone is going to raise the level of society as a whole. So that was a consistent refrain from, I heard it a lot from young people, and I heard it from the older people in the kind of as a default approach. I wanted to just reiterate this point that Neil's making, which is thinking systemically about problems, which is, I think, something which there still is a lack of, and it requires a certain degree of reflection about issues at more than a surface level. Very often in our community, we still diagnose problems at the surface level. We try and address the symptoms, but not think about the cause. And, that's something which I hope that I contribute to thinking about, at least a bit more reflexively on the part of the community. But I do think that is an area of weakness. Sometimes it's about thinking, let's find a problem that will solve the Muslim issue here. One example that one of an academic colleague remarked about was student loans. So in this country, when I was a student, they were minuscule. The cost of going to university were minuscule, and then suddenly they were, sent through the stratosphere. And Muslims are thinking about, how can we make halal student loans? And for me, the problem is I have a couple of very young children, and I think about, do I even want them to go to university in this country and be saddled with £50,000 of debt at current rates at the point in which they graduate? I don't think that that's fair at all to, that's not a fair thing to do to my own children. I don't think we're helping by sort of just thinking at a surface level and saying, let's get something which is halal certified, rather than thinking about, well, let's think about the harm that those sorts of policies do to young people across the board, who also are going to struggle, to raise a deposit on a home and all the rest of it. You mentioned London has one of the most, difficult housing circumstances for the last couple of years and going back for a while. So those are problems which Muslims, who make up 15% of London's, and this is not a London-centric, very deliberately not a London-centric report. There are Muslims in other parts of the country but when it comes to housing, London is probably one of the worst markets in the country, and Muslims make up 15% of the population. They're a particularly young demographic. How are they supposed to survive in that sort of situation unless there are systemic changes?
This point is quite fascinating because I think it sort of fits with the sort of polluted river theory that there's you're at the banks of a river that's polluted at the very top by a chemical factory or whatever. You can't just try to get your bit of the river to be non-polluted. You have to clean up the river entirely. So I mean, the examples that you're giving, I mean, the student loan, health service, which is very, very important, especially for Muslim families who, loathe the idea or the concept of putting their parents up in residential care homes or the such, is extremely important. Education. I mean, we're talking now about a sector where Muslims have incredible concerns for a variety of reasons. So, and this brings me to the question is, is it acceptable? Is it even fair that the Muslim community says, you know what, I'm not concerned about anyone else right now. I want the sector that I wish to engage with to be of this, and criteria, and I don't care about the rest. Is this firstly possible, and secondly, is it even fair, and does it fit with the values of a Muslim? I mean, this is part of the question that annoys me often when I'm in discussion with various Muslim organizations because I feel that there is this sort of sense of exclusivity, that this is something that I care about, and I need to do this for myself and my kids right now. Well, my thought is, listen, if the air is polluted, it's going to pollute everyone. It doesn't really matter, whether you're a Muslim or a non-Muslim. You're going to suffer as a result, and therefore you need to clean the air. Is that fair? Is that even reasonable and probable?
Well, it's not specific to the Muslim community, though. And that if there is an attitude of, I'll just plow on and ignore my neighbor, that's why faith is so important. I mean, all faiths, if you read any of the books, indicate that Jesus says, as a Christian myself, you have to love your neighbor as yourself, which means you need to develop yourself. But so it's not a selfish thing, but equally, you've got to love the neighbor equally. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did also say, as I was taught by great leaders like yourselves in a way, and Dr. Barry, that when asked who is the leaders, he said it's the 40 people to the right, left of you, and the 40 people to the right. And then when pressed, well, who weren't really in my leader? It's the people nearest you. And I would use that as an argument for why Brexit is a terrible idea. I'm sorry to suddenly go into that. And I hope that doesn't offend anybody. But basically, abandoning our neighbors in Europe makes no sense in human terms, in my opinion. Maybe in economic terms it does, but it doesn't look like it has done.
It doesn't look like it, does it?
Unfortunately.
So that's why faith is so important. So we must hang on to our faiths, our specific faiths. And the teachings of the founders of those faiths are so important because they do get to the point. Love your neighbor. And then Muhammad never said, love your Muslim neighbor. He said, love the neighbor. And Jesus never said, love the Christian neighbor.
It's an incredible foundation for a real society, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's almost all we need.
I mean, I would venture to say that actually this is the crucial role that faith has in a secular society, because in a sort of unremitting secularist ethos, on what basis do you help other people? If, our sort of capitalist norms say that actually greed is good and you should serve your self-interests and the invisible hand will do its job. Well, in reality, we are living the consequences of that, and it's austerity for the poor and, absurd profits for the super rich. So I think that, this is another regard in which the values of faith really need to inform. British Muslim civil society needs to get out into the wider society, and this is an opening gambit to do something like that. I mean, we have to have these on a regular basis. The Missing Muslims report was basically saying the same thing, that we need to, in your case, one of the messages that I took away is that society needs to recognize the barriers they're putting up to Muslims. Yes. And I think that that's, still something which is very valid and true. And I wanted to ask you actually about that, like, how do we follow up on these things? What's your experience been? But also that Muslims now can grasp the nettle themselves, take the bull by the horns, as it were, and try and think, what can we actually do at our end to increase our own agency, to increase our own footprint on bringing our values, our positive civic-minded values into wider society, and make these things what it means to be British.
All this raises so many questions. I mean, as you were talking just now, something came to mind that part of the problem that British Muslims speak of, and you can travel across the country and you'll find this comes up time and again, in that the problem that British Muslims have, whilst healthy in numbers, healthy in terms of their diversity in the sectors of society that they occupy, even in terms of their relations with their neighbors, most would say that those are quite positive as well. But the problem that they constantly speak about is the lack of political leadership. Now, once again, one of the questions I would ask back in retort is, well, do we need a Muslim political leadership? But reading in your report, there seems to be also that area as well mentioned. Especially, for instance, that you have one MP and one member of the House of Lords
two members of the
who have opened the report. So the question is, how important is political leadership for the Muslim civil society?
So I am going to come back and ask Neil about how we follow up these things. So hopefully that can be a follow-up to this particular comment. But I happen to think that so we very often celebrate that we've got a significant number of Muslim parliamentarians in this country. And I don't disagree with that, although I think we can also recognize that some of them aren't particularly exemplary when it comes to standing up for whether it's the Muslim community or the needs of the dispossessed in society. But at the same time, if you do the maths and look at 6.5% of the population being Muslim, I think we have about half as many parliamentarians as would be MPs as would represent the proportion of Muslims in this country. So we're a sizable community. So obviously there are going to be some Muslim MPs, but we've got a long way to go. We're a democracy.
Is that important?
I think so. We're a democracy. We need representation at every level. And it's through these sorts of conversations that it's through information asymmetries, to use a bit of a technical term, that Muslims get lost out in a lot of public discourse. And by having our representatives there, by having our reports published, and feeding into that civic conversation, we can hopefully do a lot better. I think it is important. That's my personal take on that. But I also, just to go back to Neil on this, that I think it's important for us to keep on writing these sorts of reports and keep on having these conversations within our communities. But how do you gain traction in the policy realm? How do you get people who have the levers of power at their disposal, especially in contexts where we've shifted so dramatically to the right in this country, particularly since Brexit, that it's become quite inhospitable for a lot of people who are maybe ethnic minorities. And this is a point that you were making very strongly in the recommendations of the Missing Muslims report. And, I've made similar recommendations off the back of that. But for me, the question is, what do we have to do now to make sure that this stuff isn't just forgotten and left on a bookshelf somewhere?
Well, I was just thinking it was very helpful to have this opportunity. So I reread the Missing Muslims report, and I remember we did make lots of recommendations to civil society, because that was who it was for. We did recommend it because we was not a panel of Muslims. We purposely had Jewish commissioners and secular commissioners and so on, who all wanted the Muslim community to participate. Of course, that was what it was all about. There were two particular requests of government we put in. We didn't want lots of requests to government because it is contrary to what we're trying to say, which is not all about government. However, the government, there were two things that hadn't happened at the time, and frankly, they've still never happened. So you could say this report was just gathering dust. The specific one was to recognise the Muslim Council of Britain. It didn't have to be MCB, but it had to be a Muslim organisation, and to talk to them regularly, particularly if there was an issue and violence took place somewhere. You've got to call on the most representative body that to speak to. But this government has consistently failed to reach out to MCB, or really
declare that it's disengaging.
Exactly. It is proud of not being, even though some of the people in the government, of course, are Muslim and Tories in that case. The other thing we wanted them to do was, which was the easier thing to do, which was recognize the definition of Islamophobia, which pretty well everybody else had recognized. It maybe there's a word wrong and so on, but it was a principle. The easiest thing to say, yes, we recognize this, as we do the similar Jewish one. That was recognized immediately when that came out a few years before. We tried to get the recognition for Islamophobia acknowledged. The point being, that's why we need more people in the parliament, I guess, and then it's lovely to see the Muslim women are well represented in parliament. So the more the merrier. But the more the merrier at district level, at council level, and so on. But also, for thinking of young people, if they don't want to do that, then they must create their own campaign group about some local issue. It's not an easy thing to do, but frankly, that's the way you cut your teeth. There's a big issue about mold in housing, and many people experience it and put up with it, but the child died. That gave us the opportunity to say this has to stop, and there's lots of fuss about it now, and maybe it will stop. But basically, there's plenty for people to do. The other great thing about Islam, I have to say, because I'm a real follower of Islam, though a Christian, is not drinking. I'm embarrassed in the city of London on a Friday night to see everybody out drinking. It must be hard if you're a Muslim to not go to that feast of alcohol. And I'm sure some say, okay, I'll just have one drink. But it's that pressure which is unfortunate, because I know the consequences of not going on a Friday night, if you want to be a good lawyer, are quite serious, because you're seen as standoffish and so on. On the other hand, it gives you plenty of time. That's the point. Plenty of time to put together your action team to go out and show the people drinking that actually you can carry on drinking, but I'm going to change the world.
It gives you plenty of time in more than one sense, because it will give you a longer life as well.
Well, exactly. That's right.
A friend of mine who went to the World Cup in Qatar.
Oh, yes.
And he came back, and one of the things he said, listen, for about 32 years, I've been working alongside Muslims. One of my neighbors is a Muslim. He said, but it took 5 days in Qatar to realize how it's very, very possible to live in an alcohol-free situation, have fun, enjoy yourselves, and enjoy, the company of other people. He said it just took 5 days, rather than 32 years. It's, the report was commissioned by the APPG on British Muslims?
It was done with their support.
It was, right. Tell me a little bit about the APPG on British Muslims, because most people, and I include myself here, would recognize the APPG on British Muslims as being the body that produced the official definition of Islamophobia, which in itself created a bit of a discussion. But like Neil said, a word here, a word there. But what else does the APPG on British Muslims do?
So APPGs are interesting institutions, and Neil will have more experience with them than I have, actually. But all-party parliamentary groups are kind of like societies for parliamentarians, in the way that you have societies at university. Yeah. Certain people, I think you need a minimum of 5 parliamentarians. I might be wrong, that it might be even lower than that. And someone comes to them and says, we want to have a discussion of this sort of a theme or this sort of a topic. Are you interested in sort of being the chair or co-chair or treasurer, etc., of something like that? And it's usually from outside funds. And so it'll be typically charities. It actually was scrutinized recently by Sky News. I think in a way it's very healthy. and because we need to have as open democracy as possible, and sometimes APPGs could be misused as well in that sense. So the APPG on British Muslims is just a series of. We were very gratified to have Naz Shah MP and Baroness Saida Warsi, who are both co-chairs. Steve Baker was very generous in that he came and attended the entire launch.
Right. Who's the chair of the APPG?
The co-chair right now is Naz Shah MP. Right. And Baroness Saida Warsi is, I think she is the treasurer. So she's the treasurer. Okay. Oh, she's the vice chair, Naz Shah. And the chair, you've caught me a little.
Because I'm trying to think who's the chair of the APPG on British Muslims. I really don't know. I think I'll need to do a little bit of search on that. Yeah. But regarding,
Steve Baker may be. But yeah.
What does it do? What does it do for me as a British Muslim? What does it do?
So the APPGs, and I think, this writing of this report gave me an experience which demonstrated to me that actually we need to engage those spaces as well. They often get neglected, and it doesn't need to happen all the time. Not massive amounts of resources need to be put in, but if we do have the occasional report which we can present there, we had roughly 10 to 12 parliamentarians attend. The Father of the House gave the opening speech. Steve Baker, the DCMS sort of shadow secretary, and a whole host of parliamentarians. It puts our message on their map, and it was really an important thing to do for them to be. Clearly, some of them had read it very carefully and were quoting, from the footnotes in some instances, talking about like the value of this. We also actually had conversations with sort of a certain Labour Party outreach officers who were saying that we're going to pass on a summary of some of these findings to the shadow cabinet, which is very important at this point in time because they're probably going to be in power in a year and a half's time. And so I think that APPGs, in my estimation, in my limited experience with them, are these wonderful opportunities where if you know an MP who is affiliated with the APPG on British Muslims, someone like Naz Shah or Saida Warsi, both of whom are very committed to the well-being of the Muslim community and have really demonstrated that through years of effort, then we can take issues where we're going to formalize some kind of report, or we're going to talk about something and bring it into the spotlight in a parliamentary discussion. But that's only one step in a lot of steps to trying to influence the way in which we are governed. And I think it behoves all people involved in a democracy to think about, what can we do to improve our democracy and how can we give our input. I think Neil already indicated that doing this at a local level is perhaps even more important than at central government, because the Westminster bubble is not really how our democracy should operate. Should be a small component of it, and power is unfortunately far too centralized sometimes in these institutions. We need to have I'm a great believer in devolution, but we need to have devolved powers in local councils, and we need to have Muslims working in local councils, and they can achieve huge amounts. I think, Tower Hamlets is a fantastic example of that.
But at the same time, Usaama, we can also argue that it's extremely difficult for a Muslim candidate to come through.
Yes.
Whether it be in terms of the mainstream political parties, whether it be in terms of councils. Only recently we've had the spectacle of the elected president of the NUS, of the National Union of Students, sacked and investigated and then sacked based on her opinions expressed on Facebook or Twitter 10 years ago.
I got the impression she was sacked and then investigated.
Or probably that, or probably that. And it is as though this keeps proving to us how arduous it is, how difficult it is for a Muslim, man or woman, to come through the ranks and to actually achieve their rightful positions. This particular lady was elected by a landslide victory as president of the NUS, yet she didn't spend a single day probably in office simply because she was investigating from the word go. This is truly a problem.
Well, I agree. I think you've got to be 4 times stronger or more focused if you're a Muslim in Britain. Not obviously in all countries, but certainly in Britain, you have to struggle to override the Islamophobia that exists and the stereotyping that exists. But those that do, it is massively worth it, because then they become a role model for the younger generation, a role model, frankly, for participating in their doing. And we've just talked about two guys in Scotland who are doing pretty well. And
you've both, I believe, stood for sort of constituencies at some point in the past,
yes.
right?
Yes,
yeah.
Some of our London boroughs, of course, there is a good smattering of councillors.
But you see, the thing is, I mean, Neil, let's be honest. I mean, even Hamza Yusuf, he had to say when it comes to equal marriages, he said that regardless of my faith. And what caught my attention was, why did he need to say this? Why did he need to say, regardless of my faith? Why is it so difficult for a Muslim? And I'm going to say a Muslim, but I'm sure that this happens also.
Everyone.
This happens across the board for a Christian, for instance, a Catholic or a Jew or a Hindu or the such. But why is it that someone who wishes to attain the highest office needs to sort of marginalize or sideline their faith or their principles or their belief in order to get to that position? Surely that's not for the benefit of society.
It doesn't come with the job, effectively. I think, hopefully, it's because I am a Muslim, I want to do this. I do think Islam has a problem with same-sex and LGBT people. That's the only blip on the horizon is the failure to recognize what everyone else recognizes, is that homosexuality has been with us forever, and we have to get over it almost. So I noticed that he had said that this morning, and of course the evangelical Christian lady,
yes, Kate Forbes, I think.
That's right. Suddenly her support has collapsed, and she's lost people by saying she couldn't agree with it.
But does that mean that we need to, if there's something I believe so dearly, does that mean that I have to forego any political or leadership aspiration as a result?
No, not at all. I don't think. But you have to stand on what you believe in. And I sort of like the way he put it, which is faith. I'm a Muslim for pretty well everything else, other than I disagree with the position of Islam, which is what, in a way, he's saying on LGBTQ issues. That doesn't mean to say there's anything wrong with him, because to get a Muslim to run the Scottish National Party is fantastic.
It is. I mean, this actually, because I wear a theologian's hat as well, and it can become quite complicated from a theological perspective, because if something is sort of very clear-cut as a prohibition in the Quran, and then you come out and you say, well, actually, I accept all of the Quran, but not that bit, that technically places you outside of the faith, because you're supposed to accept the entire Quran. By the sort of testimony of the Quran itself. So, I mean,
But my question, Usaama, is that is this a reflection on Hamza Yusuf? I mean, I'm sorry that I'm singling him out, but it's just one example out of many. But is this a reflection on him, or is this a reflection on society and where someone of faith finds him or herself within that society, vis-a-vis their aspirations to lead?
I have a very particular perspective on this. I mean, I can share it if that's, I mean, I'm not, it's maybe somewhat idiosyncratic, but, societies have norms. I happen to argue that, secularism can be conceptualized as a religion of a sort, which has certain value systems. Some might describe it as a civil religion, as some sociologists have. And so, when tenets of different religions come to be at loggerheads, the dominant religious tradition in a society will set the template of what is or is not acceptable. So I think in these sorts of societies, we just have to, as Muslims and as someone who, adheres to a Quranic theological paradigm, I would recognize that, my perspective on gay marriage would not be welcome in the political sphere. And I would have to make a case that, look, I mean, I don't know the language that someone like Hamza Yusuf used, but perhaps he used something like this, that regardless of my own personal faith commitments in these areas, which are, in the context of this secular society, I will treat them in public office as a personal religious commitment.
Yeah, that's a fair a fair take.
I will uphold the laws of this context. And scholars like, people we admire have pointed to the prophet Joseph in the Quran, who was a minister effectively, or the treasurer in an Egyptian sort of non-Muslim state. So I think, there are ways in which those compromises, but I don't think personally that the language used should be a denial of what's in the Quran because I'm a Muslim.